Hi again then guys, and welcome to another look back into the past of the Forza franchise, once again to Forza Motorsport 3, to the twin, if you will, of a car which we've already taken a look at, the Champion Racing pair of Audis. Now we already of course discussed the Champion Racing RS6, good car in its own way, some great points, some not so good points potentially, depending on the driver and the driving style. And now we have the little brother, in effect, the S4, also from Champion Racing, and this car is a vehicle which we touched on in that episode, and some of the advantages of this one are fairly obvious. For instance, it's lighter. You could probably guess that it would be. It's a smaller car as well, which means that as well as being lighter on its feet, it's also more nimble and better for tighter circuits, which is always a nice advantage to have, especially in these touring car type machines. The weight, for instance, is around 40 kilos less, or close to it. That's not a ridiculous amount less, but still, less is good. You still have all-wheel drive, which is nice to have, and the power and torque are far lower, but are still very good. In fact, although it's an S4, you're actually putting out roughly the same kind of power as what the later generation RS4 would have. 420 horsepower, which is a little bit higher than that car, 345 pound-feet of torque, and instead of the big 4.2 litre V8 of the RS6, in this one you've got a 2.8 litre, so again, much more thumpy an engine, and also more suited to the car. Having the massive 4.2 litre in this one wouldn't necessarily sit well, as cool as it might initially seem, and then of course in the RS6, the 2.8, it wouldn't necessarily feel at home. The power and torque especially, aren't really high enough to lug around the big all-wheel drive weight of that car. Now the pricing, interestingly enough, is exactly the same on both cars. They both cost 150,000 credits, and the category is also the same. They are both S-Class cars, although, as you'd assume, this one is slightly lower, 644 PI to the 655 of the RS6. So they compare pretty well. But the real question, of course, is what are they actually like to drive when you get them out on the track? Because you can talk about great numbers all day, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one car is always going to be better than another. Consider Rivals, for instance, the series on this channel, where we pit cars against each other. Oftentimes the car with worse numbers on paper will still be quicker, because it's not about sheer numbers always, although, of course, sheer numbers can certainly help. Now, in the case of the RS6, it definitely feels like it's got more grunt in a straight line, because it does have more grunt in a straight line. But through corners, there's no question that the S4 is a far more nimble machine, and also I would say that although the RS6 is a fairly forgiving car for beginners, it is still heavy, and I touched on that in the review for that one, in particular over the front end without adjusting the diff in its, in effect, untuned form, if you want to look at it that way, or at least untuned by the player. It's quite heavy over the front end, and even when you adjust it, some of that is always there. Whereas with this S4, although it is still all-wheel drive, because of the fact that the car is physically smaller, it's a little bit lighter, it also has less power and in particular a lot less torque to deal with, 345 compared to the 409 on the RS6, it handles itself in a much more sprightly way. The RS6 feels like what it is, this big, heavy, powerful luxury limo, in effect, which now happens to be a touring car, which isn't exactly ideal. You don't see Mercedes making touring cars out of the S-Class, for instance. They tend to go for the C-Class because that makes more sense, or even the E-Class. Whereas this for Audi is more like taking an E-Class race car, or the equivalent to it. It's not quite as bad as trying to make the A8 into a race car, but still, it has that same kind of oversized disadvantage which the S4 just doesn't have. Now, both cars are excellent, they both have strong advantages, and neither of them really have awful disadvantages, but I would say that the disadvantages of this one are a little bit harder to find than the RS6. You can quite quickly feel the disadvantage of the RS6, which is that heaviness that I mentioned, whereas with this one, the S4, I have to say it's a really strong all-rounder. It's a very nicely set up car, even without upgrading it yourself. The power feels good enough. The weight, although of course you could always drop it more, it feels good. It is light on its feet. It's definitely far more nimble than the RS6, and so overall, although it's a fairly simple review, there's a good reason for that. And although simple reviews aren't necessarily the most entertaining, in a way, simple reviews kind of highlight the best cars, because if you can cover all of a car's bases in about 4 or 5 minutes, that indicates it's probably quite a good choice to go for. And I would say that that's the case here. It's not the kind of race car which will blow your mind in any particular way. There are certainly more exciting options out there. For me personally, I would still choose the Cadillac equivalent instead, but that's just a personal preference. However, for this kind of Pirelli World Challenge style machine, this one is a very good one to go for, and in fact I might say that this one is an even better beginner's car than the RS6 is, for the aforementioned reasons. So it's definitely worth checking out this car. Kind of a shame that the pair of them aren't featured anymore, but if you're going to pair back cars, it kind of makes sense to take out something like these. They weren't hugely popular online from what I can remember, and although they do have their fans, they're not exactly the kind of car that most people are clamouring to see return. However, if you do go back to the game or other Forza games to feature it, definitely check it out. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.